In the dusty town of Copper Ridge, 1887, a man who'd lived alone in the Devil's Crown Mountains for over a decade walked into what he thought would be a simple auction. Silas Kane had never spoken to a child in his life, had no family, no friends, just a bitter past that drove him to isolation. But when he impulsively spent his last $5 on 3 forgotten orphans, the smallest one looked up at him with knowing eyes and whispered a name that made his blood run cold. A name she couldn't possibly know. A name that would unravel secrets buried deeper than any mine shaft and transform a broken, childless man into something he never thought possible. This is the story of how $5 changed 4 lives forever, and how sometimes the family you never knew you needed finds you in the most impossible ways. The wind carved through Thunder Valley like a knife through leather, carrying with it the scent of pine and regret. Snow still clung to the higher peaks of the Devil's Crown Mountains, stubborn patches that refused to surrender to spring's tentative advance. It was the kind of cold that settled into a man's bones and stayed there, the kind that made solitude feel like both punishment and sanctuary. Silas Kane stood at the edge of his property, watching the morning mist rise from the valley below like the ghosts of conversations he'd never had. His cabin sat behind him, solid and weathered, built with hands that once knew gentleness but had forgotten the feel of anything softer than axe handles and rifle stocks. The structure was larger than a single man needed, with rooms that echoed with emptiness and windows that framed nothing but wilderness. He'd built it 7 years ago with different intentions. Back then, he'd had plans that involved laughter bouncing off these walls, small feet running across these floorboards, maybe even a woman's voice calling his name from the kitchen. But plans, he'd learned, were just hope dressed up in prettier clothes, and hope had a way of dying slow in the mountain air. The letter in his coat pocket crinkled as he shifted his weight. 3 months old now, the paper worn soft from being unfolded and read too many times. Dr. Nathaniel Cross had been gentle but direct in his delivery. The fever that nearly killed him 2 winters back had left scars deeper than the ones visible on his skin. Children weren't in his future. Not by blood anyway. Silas had accepted it the way he accepted most things, with the grim resignation of a man who'd learned that life took more than it gave. He'd stopped going to town except when supplies ran dangerously low, stopped making conversation with the few neighbors scattered throughout the valley, stopped planning for anything beyond the next season's firewood. But today was different. Today the supplies had run out, and the empty pantry shelves mocked him with their bareness. Salt, flour, coffee, the basics that kept a man alive when living felt more like enduring. He'd hitched up his old mule, loaded the wagon with furs and carved trinkets he could trade, and made the long journey down to Copper Ridge. The town bustled with its usual chaos of merchants and miners, cowboys and confidence men. Silas kept his head down, hat pulled low, moving through the crowds like a shadow. He preferred it that way. Conversations led to questions, and questions led to places he didn't want to revisit. He'd finished his trading and was heading back to his wagon when the commotion near the church caught his attention. A crowd had gathered, voices rising and falling like the murmur of disturbed bees. Against his better judgment, curiosity pulled him closer. Mrs. Prudence Whitmore stood on the church steps, her voice cutting through the morning air with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. She was a stern woman, all sharp angles and sharper words, the kind who ran the county orphanage with iron discipline and little warmth. 3 children, she announced, her voice carrying across the gathered townspeople. Ages 7, 5, and 3. No known relatives, no benefactors. The orphanage is full, and the county can't afford to keep feeding mouths that don't contribute. Silas felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd heard of such auctions before, whispered about in saloons and general stores, but he'd never witnessed one. Children, sold like livestock to whoever would take them. Behind Mrs. Whitmore, Three small figures huddled together on the church steps. The oldest, a boy with dark hair and eyes that held too much understanding for his age, stood protectively in front of the others. A girl with auburn braids clutched his shirt, her knuckles white with fear. And the smallest, barely more than a baby, sat silent and still, watching the crowd with an expression that seemed far too knowing for someone so young. The bidding started low. $2 for the set, then $3. The voices calling out numbers felt obscene, reducing these children to the value of a good meal or a bottle of whiskey. Silas found himself stepping forward without conscious thought, his hand moving toward the coins in his pocket. Something about the way the children stood together, united against a world that had already failed them, stirred something deep in his chest, something he thought had died with that doctor's letter. The auction continued with the casual cruelty of commerce. Silas watched from the back of the crowd as Mrs. Whitmore's voice grew sharper, more insistent. The children hadn't moved from their huddle on the church steps, but he could see the tension in their small bodies, the way they seemed to shrink with each callous bid. $4, called out a man near the front. Silas recognized him. Jake Morrison, a rancher known more for his harsh treatment of his workers than his success with cattle. The thought of those children under Morrison's roof made Silas's jaw clench. $4.50, countered another voice. This one belonged to Mrs. Eleanor Hutchins, who ran a boarding house on the edge of town. Silas had heard the stories. Children worked like servants, fed scraps, treated as little more than unpaid labor. The boy on the steps squared his shoulders, wrapping his arms around his sisters in a gesture that was both protective and defiant. Even from a distance, Silas could see the determination in the child's face, the refusal to show fear, even as his world crumbled around him. Mrs. Whitmore's patience was wearing thin. Do I hear $5? $5 for the lot? Silence stretched across the gathered crowd. $5 was a considerable sum, enough to buy a horse or a month's worth of supplies. For three children of unknown temperament and questionable usefulness, it seemed most folks had reached their limit. Going once, Mrs. Whitmore announced, her gavel raised. The Morrison man shifted his weight, preparing to claim his prize. Silas found himself stepping forward before his mind caught up with his actions. $5. The crowd turned as one, surprised murmurs rippling through the assembled townspeople. Silas Kane, the hermit from the mountains, hadn't been seen in town for months. Most had forgotten he existed at all. Mrs. Whitmore blinked in surprise. Mr. Kane? Did you say $5? Silas nodded, his throat suddenly dry. He pulled the coins from his pocket, his last 5 silver dollars, meant for winter supplies and emergency provisions. $5 for all three. Jake Morrison scowled. Now hold on, I was about to... The bid stands at $5, Mrs. Whitmore interrupted, clearly eager to close the deal. Going once, going twice. The gavel fell with a sound like a gunshot. Silas's ears rang as the crowd began to disperse, some shaking their heads in bewilderment, others muttering about the strange ways of mountain men. He barely heard them. His eyes were fixed on the three children who were now, impossibly, his responsibility. Mrs. Whitmore bustled down the steps, her hand extended for payment. Most irregular, she muttered as Silas placed the coins in her palm. A bachelor taking on 3 children. I do hope you understand the magnitude of what you've committed to, Mr. Kane. Silas didn't respond. He was watching the children, who had remained frozen in their protective huddle. The oldest boy was studying him with suspicious eyes, clearly trying to determine what manner of man had just purchased their lives. Samuel, Mrs. Whitmore called sharply, gather your things. You belong to Mr. Kane now. The boy, Samuel, helped his sisters to their feet. The middle child, Clara, clutched a small cloth doll that had seen better days. But it was the youngest who drew Silas's attention. She had pale blonde hair that caught the morning sunlight and eyes the color of winter sky. Unlike her siblings, she wasn't looking at Mrs. Whitmore or even at the dispersing crowd. She was looking directly at him. Silas approached slowly, the way he might approach a wounded animal. He knelt on the church steps, bringing himself to their eye level. Samuel tensed, ready to run or fight if necessary, but the little girl took a small step forward. "What's your name?" Silas asked gently, addressing all three, but keeping his eyes on the youngest. "I'm Samuel," the boy said quickly, as if establishing himself as their spokesman. "This is Clara, and she's—" "Little Dove," the smallest child whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. Silas nodded. Strange name, but then orphans often carried unusual stories. "Well, Samuel, Clara, Little Dove, I suppose you'll be coming with me." He stood and gestured toward his wagon, loaded with the day's trading goods. The children followed hesitantly, Clara whispering something to Samuel that made him nod grimly. They climbed into the wagon bed without complaint, settling among the supplies like they were used to making themselves small and unnoticed. As Silas took up the reins, Little Dove suddenly looked up at him with those startling blue eyes. Her next words hit him like a physical blow, stopping his breath in his chest. "Hello, Uncle Thomas." The reins slipped from Silas's numb fingers. Thomas. She'd called him Thomas. But Thomas Kane had been dead for 8 years, killed in a mining accident in California. Thomas Kane was his younger brother, the one person in the world Silas had truly loved and failed to protect. This child couldn't possibly know that name, couldn't know about Thomas, about the guilt that had driven Silas into these mountains, about the brother whose death still haunted his dreams. But somehow, impossibly, she did. The wagon rolled through the mountain trails in heavy silence, broken only by the creak of wheels and the steady clip of the mule's hooves on packed earth. Silas's mind reeled with questions he couldn't voice, his hands gripping the reins so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Every few minutes, he found himself glancing back at the 3 children huddled in the wagon bed, his eyes inevitably drawn to Little Dove. She sat quietly between her siblings, seemingly unaware of the bombshell she'd dropped. Her small hands were folded in her lap, and she hummed a tune so softly it was barely audible above the wind. But Silas heard it. He recognized it. It was the same melody Thomas used to whistle while working, a simple folk song their mother had sung to them as children. Samuel kept a protective arm around both girls, his young face set in lines too serious for his age. He watched Silas with the wariness of a child who'd learned that adults could change from kind to cruel without warning. Clara clutched her doll tighter with each bump in the road, her eyes darting between the unfamiliar landscape and the strange man who'd bought them. The cabin came into view as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks. Silas had always thought it looked welcoming enough, with its wide porch and stone chimney, but seeing it through the children's eyes, he wondered if it appeared more like a prison than a home, isolated, surrounded by towering pines and the endless whisper of wind through branches. "This is where you live?" Samuel asked, the first words any of them had spoken since leaving town. "It is," Silas replied, bringing the wagon to a stop near the front steps. "It's where you'll live too now." He climbed down and moved to help the children from the wagon, but Samuel was already lifting Clara down, then turning to assist Little Dove. The boy's independence was both admirable and heartbreaking. Too much responsibility for shoulders so young. Inside, the cabin felt different with their presence. The silence that Silas had grown accustomed to was replaced by the soft shuffle of small feet, the whisper of children's voices, the subtle shift in the very air that came with breathing that wasn't his own. He lit the oil lamps, their warm glow pushing back the mountain twilight. "There's a spare room upstairs," he said, unsure of how to proceed. That is, you'll sleep there." Samuel nodded and guided his sisters toward the wooden staircase. Silas watched them go, noting how Clara stumbled with exhaustion and how Little Dove paused at the bottom step to look back at him with those impossibly knowing eyes. "Uncle Thomas always said mountain cabins hold the best dreams," she said softly before following her siblings upstairs. Silas stood frozen in his parlor, the words echoing in his mind. Thomas had said that years ago, during their last conversation before he'd left for the California gold fields. But there was no possible way this child could know that. No way she could know Thomas at all. He busied himself preparing a simple supper: beans and salt pork, cornbread from dwindling supplies, milk that was starting to turn. When he called them down, the children descended the stairs like cautious deer, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. They ate in silence, the children's eyes darting around the cabin, taking inventory of their new surroundings. Silas noticed Clara saving half her cornbread, wrapping it carefully in her small handkerchief. Samuel ate methodically, as if he couldn't quite believe the food wouldn't be taken away before he finished. "You don't have to save it," Silas said gently, nodding toward Clara's hidden bread. "There'll be more tomorrow." Clara's eyes filled with tears, though she tried to blink them away. Samuel reached over and squeezed her hand. "She's just scared," he explained. "Sometimes there wasn't enough." Before, Silas felt something twist in his chest. "There's enough here. Whatever else happens, there'll always be enough food." Little Dove looked up from her plate. "Uncle Thomas used to say a man's only as good as his word. Are you as good as Uncle Thomas was?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Silas met her gaze, those blue eyes that seemed to see straight through him to places he'd tried to keep buried. "I don't know," he answered honestly, "but I aim to try." That night, after the children had gone to bed, Silas sat by the fire trying to make sense of what had happened. He'd awakened that morning as a man with no future, no purpose beyond simple survival. Now he had 3 children sleeping upstairs, their lives entirely dependent on his decisions. But it was Little Dove's impossible knowledge that haunted him most. Thomas had died alone in a California mine collapse, hundreds of miles from here. His body had never been recovered, his personal effects lost. There was no way for this child to know about him, no connection that made any sense. Unless... Silas pulled out a wooden box from beneath his bed, his hands trembling as he opened it. Inside were the few mementos he had of his brother, a photograph, a letter, and a small silver locket that had belonged to their mother. Thomas had carried it with him everywhere, claimed it brought him luck. The locket was gone. The first sign of trouble came 3 days after the children arrived. Silas found it nailed to his cabin door when he stepped out for the morning chores. A piece of paper with jagged handwriting that made his blood run cold. "Those children don't belong to you. Some debts follow a man to the grave and beyond." J.M. double quote. J.M. Silas's mind raced through possibilities, but one name kept surfacing like a stone thrown into still water. Jeremiah Morrison. Blackjack Morrison. Not Jake Morrison who'd bid at the auction, but his older brother. A man with a reputation that stretched across 3 territories like a shadow. Silas crumpled the note, his eyes scanning the tree line that surrounded his property. Nothing moved except the wind through the pines, but the feeling of being watched settled over him like a heavy coat. He'd heard stories about Blackjack Morrison in saloons and trading posts, a man who dealt in things that weren't quite legal, who collected on debts in ways that made grown men disappear into the wilderness. But what debt could possibly connect Silas to Morrison? He'd lived like a hermit for years, avoiding entanglements, keeping to himself. Unless... Papa Silas? The voice made him spin around. Little Dove stood in the doorway, still wearing the oversized nightgown Clara had found for her in the cabin's spare clothes. Her pale hair was mussed from sleep, but her eyes were alert, watching him with that unsettling awareness. "Just Silas," he corrected gently, though something warm flickered in his chest at the word Papa. "Did you sleep well?" She nodded, then stepped closer, her small hand reaching for his. Uncle Thomas used to get letters like that. They made him sad and scared. Silas knelt down to her level, his heart hammering. "What kind of letters, Little Dove?" "Mean letters, from the man with the black mustache. Uncle Thomas said the man wanted something that belonged to someone else. but Uncle Thomas was trying to keep it safe. Her fingers traced the air, as if writing invisible words. He said some promises are worth dying for. The pieces began clicking together in Silas's mind like tumblers in a lock. Thomas had gotten mixed up with Morrison somehow, before his death in California. But what had he been trying to protect? And how did little Dove know about any of it? Samuel appeared in the doorway, already dressed and alert despite the early hour. "Something wrong?" he asked, his eyes immediately going to the crumpled paper in Silas's hand. "Just mountain wind," Silas lied, tucking the note into his pocket. "You hungry? I'll get breakfast started." But as they ate their morning meal of flapjacks and syrup, Silas couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were watching them through the windows. He'd positioned himself where he could see both the front door and the back trail, his rifle within easy reach against the wall. Clara seemed to sense the tension, eating quietly and staying close to Samuel. But little Dove hummed that familiar tune again, the one Thomas used to whistle, as if she hadn't a care in the world. That afternoon, while the children played on the porch, Silas heard the sound of approaching horses. 3 riders emerged from the pine forest, moving with the casual confidence of men who expected to be feared. Silas recognized the lead rider from wanted posters he'd seen in town, a tall man with graying hair and a mustache black as coal, Jeremiah Morrison, Black Jack himself. Silas stepped onto the porch, his hand resting casually on the butt of his pistol. "You're on private property, Morrison." Black Jack smiled, but there was nothing warm in it. "Silas Kane. Been a long time since I seen you in civilized company. Heard you went and bought yourself some children." His eyes found little Dove, who had stopped her humming and was watching him with those 2 knowing blue eyes. "Mighty interesting, considering what your brother owed me." "Thomas is dead," Silas said flatly. "Has been for 8 years. Dead men don't settle their debts, true enough. But family has a way of inheriting more than they bargained for." Morrison's horse stepped closer, and Silas moved protectively in front of the children. "Your brother borrowed money from me to buy a mining claim. Said he'd struck it rich, promised to pay back double. Then that mine collapsed, and suddenly my investment disappeared along with Thomas Kane." Silas felt the children pressing against his back, Samuel's small hand gripping his coat. "I don't know anything about Thomas's business dealings." "Maybe not. But that little girl there seems to know plenty about old Thomas." Morrison's eyes never left little Dove. "Funny thing is, she looks mighty familiar. Got the same eyes as someone I used to know. Someone who ran off with my money and my brother's heart." Little Dove stepped out from behind Silas, her chin raised in a gesture of defiance that seemed far too mature for her age. "Uncle Thomas kept his promises," she said clearly, "even when it was hard. Even when bad men came looking." Morrison's face darkened. "That little girl is all the proof I need. Thomas had something that belonged to me, and now she's got it. I aim to collect what's mine, Kane, one way or another." The other 2 riders shifted in their saddles, hands moving toward their weapons. Silas calculated distances, cover, chances. 3 armed men against 1, with children to protect. The odds weren't promising. "You've got no claim here," Silas said. "Those children were legally sold at public auction." "Legal don't always mean right," Morrison replied. "I'll give you 3 days to think it over. Then I'm coming back, and I won't be asking nicely." They rode away as suddenly as they'd appeared, leaving only dust and the echo of threats hanging in the mountain air. Silas stood on his porch, watching until they disappeared into the trees, his mind racing with plans and possibilities. 3 days. He had 3 days to figure out what Thomas had been involved in, what little Dove knew that she shouldn't, and how to protect 3 children from a man who collected debts in blood. 2 days passed in tense preparation. Silas had barricaded the cabin's windows, cleaned and loaded every weapon he owned, and taught Samuel how to reload the rifle if needed. But on the morning of the 3rd day, he awoke to silence, the kind of unnatural quiet that meant predators were near. The children were gone. Silas bolted from his bed, searching every room with growing panic. Their blankets were still warm, Clara's doll left behind on the floor. No signs of struggle, no broken glass or forced entry. They'd simply vanished like morning mist. A note was pinned to the kitchen table, written in the same jagged handwriting as before. Silver Pine Ridge, come alone. Bring what Thomas stole, or the children pay his debt. Silas's hands shook as he read it. Silver Pine Ridge was a day's hard ride into the most treacherous part of the Devil's Crown Mountains, a place where old mine shafts and hidden caves made tracking nearly impossible. Morrison had chosen his ground well. But what Thomas stole? Silas still had no idea what Morrison was talking about. He'd searched through every possession of his brother's, found nothing but personal items and faded letters. Unless... He ran to the loose floorboard where he kept his most precious belongings. The wooden box was still there, but something was different. Tucked beneath Thomas's photograph was a small piece of paper he'd never seen before, folded tight and yellowed with age. With trembling fingers, he unfolded it. It was a deed, a mining claim in California, signed over to Thomas Kane by one Margaret Morrison, Morrison's daughter. At the bottom, in Thomas's familiar handwriting, for little Dove's future. Let her choose her own path. The pieces finally clicked together. Thomas hadn't stolen money. He'd fallen in love with Morrison's daughter. She'd signed over her inheritance to him, probably planning to run away together, but something had gone wrong. The mine collapse wasn't an accident. It was Morrison silencing his daughter's betrayal and Thomas's inconvenient love. And little Dove. Little Dove was Margaret Morrison's child, Thomas's child. Silas saddled his horse and rode hard toward Silver Pine Ridge, the deed clutched in his coat pocket along with every weapon he could carry. The trail wound higher into the mountains, past abandoned mining camps and the skeletal remains of dreams gone bust. He found them as the sun began to set, trapped in a natural amphitheater of rock with only one way in or out. Blackjack Morrison had built a small fire in the center, and his 2 men stood guard with rifles. The children sat together near the flames, their hands bound, but otherwise unharmed. Morrison smiled as Silas dismounted at the ridge's entrance. Punctual, I appreciate that in a man. Let them go, Silas called, his hands visible and empty. This is between you and me. Between you and your dead brother, more like. But the debt passes to family, don't it? Morrison gestured to Little Dove, especially when family includes my own granddaughter. Little Dove looked up at the sound, her blue eyes finding Silas across the firelit space. He's lying, she said clearly. Uncle Thomas told me the truth. About Mama. About everything. Morrison's face darkened. Your mama was a foolish girl who threw away everything for a worthless prospector. But you're a Morrison. That claim she signed over belongs to the family. Silas stepped forward slowly, his hand moving toward his coat. The claim's worthless. That mine collapsed years ago. Maybe, but there's other mines, other claims, and that paper makes it legal. Morrison nodded to his men, who raised their rifles. So here's how this works, Kane. You give me that deed, and I'll let you walk away. The children stay with me. They're blood, after all. No, Silas said simply. No? Morrison laughed. You're 1 man against 3, Kane. You ain't in a position to negotiate. That's when Little Dove stood up, her small fingers working at the ropes that bound her wrists. Uncle Thomas said you were a coward, Grandpa Jack. Said you killed Mama because you couldn't stand that she chose love over money. Morrison's face went white with rage. Your mama died in an accident. She died because you had her killed. Little Dove's voice carried across the amphitheater with startling clarity. Just like you killed Uncle Thomas, but he hid me first, gave me to the church people and told me to wait for the man with kind eyes who'd keep me safe. The revelation hit Silas like a physical blow. Thomas hadn't died in a random mine collapse. He'd been murdered. And somehow he'd known it was coming. Known enough to hide his daughter and trust that someday Somehow, Silas would find her. Morrison drew his pistol, his face twisted with fury. Enough lies from a child's mouth. Give me that deed, Cain, or... Silas moved faster than thought, diving behind a boulder as Morrison's shot rang out. The sound echoed off the rock walls like thunder, and suddenly the amphitheater erupted in gunfire. Morrison's men scrambled for cover as Silas returned fire, using every bit of cover the rocks provided. But it was Little Dove who turned the tide. Despite her bound hands, she rolled toward the fire and kicked burning logs toward Morrison's position. The flames scattered, creating smoke and confusion, and in that chaos, Samuel and Clara broke free of their loosened bonds. The battle was brief, but vicious. When the smoke cleared, Morrison lay motionless by the dying fire. His men fled into the mountain darkness. Silas gathered the children in his arms, his heart hammering with relief and revelation. Little Dove looked up at him with those knowing blue eyes. Thomas's eyes, he realized now. "Papa Silas," she whispered. "Uncle Thomas said you'd come. He said you always keep your promises." And Silas understood, finally, that some promises were made in blood and sealed in love, passed from brother to brother across the grave itself. The journey back to the cabin took 2 days, with the children riding double and Silas leading his horse on foot through the treacherous mountain passes. Little Dove, his niece, Thomas's daughter, had grown quiet after the confrontation, processing revelations that would challenge a grown man's understanding. Samuel and Clara stayed close to her, their own questions unspoken but visible in their worried glances. When they finally reached home, Silas built up the fire and prepared a meal while the children cleaned themselves and changed into fresh clothes. The familiar routine felt different now, weighted with new knowledge and the understanding that their family bond ran deeper than circumstance or charity. That evening, as they sat around the table sharing a simple supper of venison stew and biscuits, Little Dove finally spoke. "Uncle Thomas used to tell me stories about you," she said, her small voice cutting through the quiet. "He said you were the bravest man he knew, but you didn't know it yet." Silas set down his spoon, his throat tight. Thomas always saw things that weren't there. "He saw things that were hidden," she corrected. "Like how you built this cabin hoping for a family, even when you didn't think you'd ever have one. He said the heart knows things the mind hasn't figured out yet." Samuel looked between them, his young face serious. "Are we really family now? Not just bought family?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the fire. Silas looked at each of them. Samuel with his protective instincts and careful wisdom, Clara with her quiet strength and hidden smiles, and Little Dove with her impossible knowledge and Thomas's eyes. "Blood doesn't make family," he said finally. "Choice does. And every day I choose you three, every single day." 2 weeks later, the first visitor arrived. Silas was splitting wood when he heard the sound of approaching horses, his hand instinctively moving toward his rifle. But this rider came alone, and the badge on his chest caught the morning sunlight. Marshal Wade Harrison dismounted slowly, his weathered face showing the exhaustion of a long ride. "Silas Kane?" "That's right." Silas set down his axe but remained alert. "What brings you up here, Marshal?" "Questions mostly. There's talk in town about what happened up at Silver Pine Ridge. Black Jack Morrison's body was found, along with evidence of a gunfight." Harrison's eyes were steady, measuring. "You know anything about that?" Silas considered his words carefully. "I know Morrison threatened my children. I know he came for something that didn't belong to him. And now he's dead, and you're alive, and 3 orphans are calling you Papa." Harrison stepped closer, but his posture remained relaxed. "Funny thing is, every person I talked to in Copper Ridge said those children are better off with you than they ever were before. Even Mrs. Whitmore admitted you've done right by them." "They're good children," Silas said simply. Harrison nodded. "Morrison had warrants in 3 territories. Man like that makes enemies. Lots of ways to end up dead in the mountains." He tipped his hat. "Far as I'm concerned, the territory's better off without him. But there's something else. The marshal reached into his saddlebag and pulled out an official-looking envelope. Seems Thomas Kane had more connections than anyone knew. This came through the territorial office, addressed to his next of kin. Silas took the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a letter from a law office in San Francisco, along with several legal documents. As he read, his eyes widened. Thomas had filed a will before he died, Harrison explained. Left everything to his daughter, with you named as guardian if anything happened to him. There's a bank account, some mining investments that actually paid off, and that claim Deed Morrison was so interested in. Turns out the mine that collapsed wasn't the only one Thomas owned. Silas stared at the papers, the numbers swimming before his eyes. It was enough money to secure the children's futures, to send them to school, to give them choices Thomas never had. There's more, Harrison continued. The law office hired investigators after Thomas died. They found evidence that Morrison ordered the mine collapse, had Thomas killed when he wouldn't sell out his daughter's inheritance. Took them years to piece it together, but justice has a long memory sometimes. That night, Silas called the children together by the fire. He showed them the letters, explained what they meant in terms they could understand. Samuel asked practical questions about school and the future. Clara wondered if they could buy new dresses, and maybe a piano she'd always dreamed of playing, but little Dove just smiled, an expression of peaceful knowing that reminded Silas so powerfully of Thomas it took his breath away. Uncle Thomas said you'd take care of us, she said. He said you'd give us everything we needed, even if you didn't have much yourself. He was right, wasn't he? Silas gathered all three children close, feeling the weight and warmth of their trust. Your Uncle Thomas was right about a lot of things, but mostly he was right about family, about how love is the only thing that really matters. Outside, the mountain wind whispered through the pines, carrying with it the promise of spring and new beginnings. Inside the cabin, a family born of choice rather than blood planned their future together, built on the foundation of one man's sacrifice and another man's love. Thomas Kane was finally at rest, his daughter safe, his brother no longer alone. Some debts, Silas realized, were paid not in silver or gold, but in the currency of love, freely given and faithfully kept. 5 years passed like seasons flowing into one another, each bringing its own changes to the Kane family homestead. The cabin that had once echoed with emptiness now rang with the sounds of growth and life. Samuel's voice cracking as he entered his teenage years, Clara's laughter as she chased chickens around the yard, and little Dove's increasingly confident questions about everything from why mountains grew to where clouds went when they disappeared. Silas had used Thomas's inheritance wisely, expanding the cabin to give each child their own room, building a proper schoolhouse where Rebecca Stern, the new teacher from back east, came twice a week to instruct not just his children, but several others from neighboring homesteads. The isolation that had once defined his existence gradually gave way to community as word spread about the mountain man who'd turned 3 orphans into a family. Samuel, now 12, had grown tall and lean like his father figure, with capable hands that could mend a fence or carve a toy horse with equal skill. He'd appointed himself the man of the house whenever Silas traveled to town for supplies, taking the responsibility seriously despite Clara's frequent reminders that she was only 2 years younger and perfectly capable of looking after herself. Someone needs to keep an eye on you, Samuel would say with the gravity of someone much older. You and that temper of yours. Clara had indeed developed quite a temper, along with an iron will that could bend horseshoes if properly applied. At 10, she was the undisputed leader of any group of children that gathered at the homestead, organizing elaborate games and adventures that usually ended with someone muddy, laughing, or both. She'd also discovered a gift for music, and the piano Silas had bought for her filled the cabin with melodies that seemed to make even the wind stop and listen. But it was little Dove who continued to amaze and occasionally unsettle everyone around her. Now 8 years old, she possessed an intuitive understanding of people and situations that seemed far beyond her years. She could predict when storms were coming, sense when someone was troubled, and had an uncanny ability to say exactly what needed to be heard at precisely the right moment. "She's got the gift," old Doc Cartwright had said after Little Dove correctly diagnosed his arthritis flare-up, before he'd even mentioned his aching joints. "Some folks are just born seeing deeper than the rest of us." The first real test of their growing family came when Samuel turned 13 and began asking questions about his past. Unlike Little Dove, who knew her history, Samuel and Clara remembered little about their lives before the orphanage. The memories they did have were fragments: a woman's voice singing lullabies, the smell of bread baking, and always the shadow of loss that had brought them to Mrs. Whitmore's cold care. "I dream about a man sometimes," Samuel confided to Silas one evening as they worked together repairing the barn roof. "Tall man with dark hair like mine. He's always walking away, and I'm trying to follow, but my legs won't work right." Silas had learned over the years that the children's questions deserved honest answers, even when those answers were difficult. "Might be your father," he said carefully. "Sometimes our minds hold on to things even when we don't understand them." "Do you think he's still alive somewhere?" "I don't know, son, but I know this. Whatever happened before, whoever you were then, you're a Cain now. That means something." Samuel nodded, seeming to find comfort in the certainty of his chosen name and chosen family. But Silas could see the boy wrestling with questions that might never have answers, and he made a mental note to speak with Marshall Harrison about what records might exist from the children's past. Clara's transformation was perhaps the most dramatic. The quiet, frightened girl who had clutched her doll at the auction had blossomed into a force of nature who could argue theology with Father Santos, outride boys twice her age, and still sit quietly with Little Dove for hours, braiding each other's hair and sharing secrets. "She's going to break hearts someday," Rebecca Stern observed after Clara had passionately defended her position that women should be allowed to vote, "but she'll probably change the world while she's doing it." The greatest change came in Little Dove's relationship with her past. As she grew older, her memories of Thomas became more detailed and coherent. She spoke of him not as the mysterious Uncle Thomas of her early years, but as a real person who had loved her mother and tried to protect them both from a violent world. "He used to say that every person gets to choose who they become," she told Silas one afternoon, as they worked together in the garden she'd claimed as her own domain. "He said blood is just the beginning of the story, not the end. Smart man, your father." "He was, but he'd be happy knowing I got to choose you as my papa too." The community that had slowly formed around their homestead became official when Silas was elected to the local school board, then later appointed as a deputy marshal for the Mountain Territories. His transformation from hermit to pillar of the community seemed to surprise everyone except his children, who had always known he was capable of more than he believed. "Papa Silas saves people," Little Dove explained to a visiting preacher who was documenting frontier families. "It's just what he does." By the time Little Dove turned 8, the Cain family had become something of a legend in the territory, the story of how love could transform not just individuals, but entire communities. Children from broken homes found their way to the homestead, not to be adopted necessarily, but to see proof that families could be built rather than just born. The cabin that Silas had built for a family that never came had become exactly what he'd dreamed of, just not in the way he'd originally imagined. Thomas's sacrifice had given him a daughter, but more than that, it had given him the courage to become the man his brother had always believed he could be. 25 years had passed since that spring morning, when Silas Cain walked into Copper Ridge with $5 silver and walked out with 3 children who would change his life forever. The mountain homestead had grown into something resembling a small town, with additional cabins for Samuel's growing family, a proper schoolhouse that served children from 3 counties, and a church where Father Santos still delivered sermons about the mysterious ways Providence worked in the lives of ordinary people. Silas sat on his expanded porch in the rocking chair Samuel had built for his 60th birthday, watching his grandchildren play in the yard where Clara had once chased chickens and little Dove had first spoken his brother's name. His hair had gone completely gray, and his hands bore the permanent stains of a lifetime working the mountain soil, but his eyes still held the same quiet strength that had compelled him to bid $5 on 3 forgotten children all those years ago. Samuel had married Rebecca Stern, the school teacher, and their 4 children filled the homestead with the kind of joyful chaos Silas had once only dreamed of. The eldest, Thomas Kane II, was already showing signs of his namesake's adventurous spirit, though fortunately tempered with his father's steady wisdom. Clara had indeed broken hearts, just as Rebecca had predicted, but she'd also blazed trails across the territory, as one of the first women elected to the territorial legislature. She'd married a judge from Denver who was wise enough to appreciate her fierce independence, and their visits to the homestead were legendary affairs that usually ended with heated political debates around the dinner table, and Clara triumphantly proving her point. But it was little Dove who had surprised everyone, including herself. Now 33, she had never married, choosing instead to dedicate her life to caring for orphaned and abandoned children throughout the territory. The Little Dove Foundation, as it had come to be known, placed more than 300 children in loving homes, always with the understanding that family was something you built rather than something you were born into. "You've become your father's daughter in the best possible way," Silas often told her. Thomas would be proud. She had established a network of families willing to take in children, carefully screening each one with the intuitive gift that had never left her. Her reputation had spread far beyond the mountains, and she corresponded with children's advocates as far away as Boston and San Francisco. The homestead itself had become a refuge for children in transition, a place where they could heal and learn what family meant before moving on to their permanent homes. Little Dove had insisted on keeping the original cabin exactly as it was, with the same 3 bedrooms where she, Samuel, and Clara had first learned to feel safe. On this particular autumn evening, as the aspen leaves painted the mountainsides gold and red, Silas was expecting visitors. A telegram had arrived the week before, announcing the arrival of 3 siblings from a mining accident in Colorado. 2 boys and a girl, ages 9, 7, and 5, with no known relatives and a story that sounded achingly familiar. The wagon appeared on the trail just as the sun touched the western peaks, driven by Deputy Marshal Harrison, Wade Harrison's son, who had inherited both his father's badge and his understanding of what mattered in the mountain territories. 3 small figures sat in the wagon bed, huddled together in the way that spoke of shared trauma and fierce loyalty. Little Dove emerged from the main house, her graying hair pulled back in the same simple style she'd worn as a child. At 33, she moved with the confidence of a woman who had found her purpose and pursued it without compromise. She approached the wagon slowly, the way Silas had approached her and her siblings all those years ago. "Hello," she said gently to the children. "I'm Little Dove Kane. This is my papa, Silas, and this is our home. We've been waiting for you." The oldest boy, dark-haired and serious, climbed down from the wagon and helped his siblings. The middle child, a girl with red hair and suspicious eyes, clutched a small bundle that probably contained everything she owned in the world. The youngest, a boy barely out of toddlerhood, sucked his thumb and watched everything with wide, uncertain eyes. "We don't have anywhere else to go," the oldest said, his voice carrying the weight of premature responsibility. "Well then," Silas said, rising slowly from his rocking chair, "I suppose you'd better come inside. Little Dove's made her famous apple dumplings, and there's always room at our table." As the children followed Little Dove toward the house, the youngest boy suddenly stopped and looked back at Silas. "Are you the papa man?" he asked. Silas felt his throat tighten with familiar emotion. "I suppose I am." "Good," the boy said simply. "We need a papa man." That night, as 3 more children discovered what it meant to sleep safely under a roof built by love rather than obligation, Silas sat by his bedroom window, looking out at the stars. Thomas's sacrifice had rippled outward like stones thrown into still water, creating waves that touched lives he would never know about, in ways he could never have imagined. The story that had begun with $5 and 3 orphans had become something larger than any one family. It had become proof that love, freely given and faithfully tended, could multiply beyond all expectation. In saving 3 children, Silas had discovered that sometimes the family you choose becomes the foundation for helping countless others find their way home. Somewhere in the mountain wind, he could almost hear his brother's voice, carrying the old familiar tune, whispered words of gratitude for promises kept and love passed on. The mountain that had once been his prison had become his kingdom, and the children who had once been his burden had become his greatest blessing. The cycle would continue, as it always had, as it always would. One family at a time, one choice at a time, one $5 act of faith at a time.